Next, all 24 schoolgirls held by assailants following a mass abduction last week from a school in northwestern Nigeria have been rescued. A total of 25 girls were abducted on November the 17th from the Government Girls Comprehensive Secondary School in Kebbi State's Maga town. One of them was able to escape the same day. The remaining 24 were all rescued, according to the statement from President Bola Tinubu. No details about the rescue have been released. And the case once again raises concerns about security across Nigeria. Here to talk more about the issue, Douglas Yates, Professor of Common Law at Cergy Paris Université. Douglas, as you well know, if you watch France 24 on a regular basis over the years, a real specialist on African matters. Douglas, always a pleasure to see you. First off, this is good news. The girls are free.
Yeah, it is. But, this is retail police work we're talking about rather than jihad. But yeah, it's great news when Nigeria is able to save victims of crime. But what Nigeria needs is structural reforms that will allow it to give people an alternative to entering into organized criminal networks.
You mentioned jihad. That automatically, to many of us, will bring up the name Boko Haram.
Right.
I'm wondering whether Boko Haram as a group is still a threat to Nigeria.
Well, it's a different kind of threat. So Islamic terrorism still has fuel left in it as an ideological movement. But that movement in Nigeria was always just a pretense. It was a justification for criminal acts. What we have now going on are criminal acts without ideological justification. It really is things falling apart. So yes, Boko Haram, yes, Islamic terror remains a threat in the north, but these new kinds of bandits, these Fulani who are incapable of feeding their herds because of climate change, and organized crime who simply are hijacking people, whatever their religion, and taking money, those are now a more diffuse threat and harder to manage than an organized ideological movement.
Indeed, you've pointed out very clearly the Fulani that we've reported on in the past involved in cattle rustling and crimes between groups. Now it seems basically targeting others, schools, for instance, and that's the alarming thing when you hear about a group of girls in that sense being kidnapped.
Yeah, and the thing with the Fulani is they get blamed in many countries for terrorist and criminal acts. But it's important to remember that they're such a large people and they have no nation state. They are really a problem of the scramble of Africa, the curse of Berlin, because everywhere you have the Fulani, nowhere do they manage to capture the state. And so in the north of Nigeria, they find themselves out. They're not Hausa, they're not part of the structure, and so they end up using their skills in the way that they can to gather together the golden crumbs of criminal activity in one of the poorest regions of Nigeria.
Indeed, you point that out, one of the poorest regions of Nigeria, which of course everyone's struggling to make a living. These people, as you say, kind of outcasts in that sense. How do you begin to get that into line? Because trying to police that, trying to regulate all of that, it must be nigh on impossible.
Right. So the thing about fighting crime is that crime never goes away. So if you invest simply in fighting crime, that's a management of the problem, but not an eradication. The kinds of things Nigeria needs to do is to create alternatives of development for the Northwest. So Nigeria, for example, is a big food producer, and that region can produce food, including pastoralism. But food no longer really offers young people who have iPhones the big riches they want. And of course, in Nigeria, everyone knows the big money comes from oil. So the kinds of things Nigeria needs to do to offer this region, the youth in that region, a better future, it doesn't have available to it. And so that means that it needs to go to Plan Bis, which is managing through police activity in a vast territory where they're not fighting an armed group, but they're fighting civilians who can blend into the population with ease. Bola Tinubu on top is a businessman from Lagos. He's not a northerner, so he's not able to make the kinds of ethnic or religious appeals that we have when you have a president who's a northerner.
You mentioned the point that President Tinubu is from Lagos, from the south of Nigeria. It very much is a story of the country almost split in two in terms of one half having more a real north-south divide kind of thing.
Yes, all across West Africa, in this part of West Africa, all the way from Ivory Coast to Ghana, to Togo, to Benin, to Nigeria, and to Cameroon. You have the north of the country that's less developed, that's poorer, that has ethnic grievances, sometimes voting grievances. Nigeria is no different, and that's why in the northeast, towards Lake Cameroon, you have Boko Haram, and in the northwest, you have the bandits. What can be done to redress the north-south divide? One would be regional integration, where Nigeria could play a critical role. If you could create a regionally integrated West Africa that did Pan-Africanism, those in the north would be able to benefit broadly from the wealth of all of the region. The other would, of course, be secession. And secession always remains on the agenda for people who are excluded. The problem with the Northwest is they don't have any resource base that would provide them a feasible alternative to living on oil rents from
Indeed,
Abuja.
because if you just split the country in two, it wouldn't actually change the fact that in the north, people can't basically get enough together to live. That's
right.
That's the fundamental issue.
And we see the same thing in Ivory Coast. In Ivory Coast, they ended up having a civil war where the north seceded from the south. In Nigeria, the civil war had been the Niger Delta had broken off at one point. And as of 1970, they've been able to manage secessionist movements. But half the country is Muslim, lives in the north. The Muslims had been able to capture the military, had benefited greatly during military rule, had built the capital in Abuja to try to move the gravity of politics away from Lagos. But in order to maintain democracy, they have an informal compact where they alternate between a northerner and a southerner. And right now, a southerner's in power. And while the cat's away, the mice will play.
Hear what you're saying completely. You mentioned this idea about some kind of federal structure to create more growth within that region. There is something called ECOWAS, which has been, I suppose, working along those lines. I take it from what you're saying that isn't working well enough.
Well, the thing about international organizations, Europe is, of course, the greatest world model we have, is you have to have common projects. So the last great project of Europe was the euro. Those who joined remain more committed to Europe. Those who opted out, in some cases, left the European Union. What ECOWAS has not managed yet to succeed is at that common project. They got ECOMOG together, which was a regional security organization where they intervened successfully in several conflicts. But what they're trying to do is create a currency. If they could get a common project towards creating a West African currency, that would give this international organization some momentum. In the meantime, what's happened is the coups that have broken out in the Sahel have broken off and tried to create their own organization. It won't survive. It doesn't have the basis, but it shows the need and the real thirst for something bigger than the post-colonial nation state in West Africa. And Nigeria, as the regional hegemon, is the make-or-break partner in that alliance.
Douglas, I'm sorry to monopolise you for this long period in time, but I sense you can tell us a little bit more about this aspect of creating business and creating opportunities there, because once upon a time, one might have thought it was about international investment coming in. Of course, the worst example of that was colonialism coming in a very different format. Now, we don't want that to happen again, and that's not going to help anybody. But getting international players to come in with investment, with ideas, with ingenuity, is that feasible in a situation where security is a problem?
Right. So we're seeing a coup d'etat today, for example, in Guinea-Bissau. And that risk for all investors, the risk that you'll lose everything to a change in regime, keeps a lot of foreign investors out. But those investors are already out. The new ones who are coming in from Indonesia, from India, from China, from Malaysia, from Brazil, those investors have found that they can flourish in an unstable environment. They're willing to accept the risks, and they're willing to come in. The big problem for West Africa integration until now has been that they all make the same things. That's no longer the case. It used to be coffee, cocoa, cotton, some simple exports. But now that we have a more complex environment, and now that resources are getting scarcer, including arable land, and now that West Africans are more educated, better integrated into the system, and part of the international community of communications, they're sophisticated enough to start to take the lead on a variety of sectors where they can create their own development. And that's always been the dream since Kwame Nkrumah, which is breaking the chain with foreign investors. And there are areas where Nigeria is taking the leadership. We're looking at, for example, energy production, solar energy, things where Nigeria can move away from its oil curse and into a 21st century, a future where it could be harvesting and selling renewable energy and using arable sustainable development for agriculture and be the food basket of the region.
Indeed, Douglas, thank you. And of course, the bottom line of that is moving away from the kind of criminality which has resulted in 24 girls being kidnapped, who are now all back safe, we are pleased to report. Douglas Yates, as always, pleasure to see you. Thank you for coming in. It's always a privilege to have your insight on these things. Professor of Common Law at Cergy Paris University, but as we heard, a real expert on all matters African. Great to see you, sir. Thank you for joining us once again. Thank you. We take a very short break. After that, more news. Stay with us.